On the morning of May 17, 1944, Lieutenant Phil Adair took charge of a small formation of Burma Banshees, a group of 4 Curtiss P-40 fighter planes with fearsome designs on their noses. Sharp-toothed skulls that seemed to scream through the air. These aircraft were instantly recognizable, and their appearance alone could unsettle anyone on the receiving end. Their mission that day was clear: attack and destroy Japanese positions on the ground to support the fighting below. The ground war in Burma was bitter, and air support often meant the difference between holding a line and losing it entirely. As Adair gripped the control stick, he guided his plane's nose downward, toward the endless expanse of the Burmese jungle, its treetops forming a thick, tangled carpet of green. The humid air shimmered with haze, and in the distance, small bursts of light flashed against the foliage. Sporadic gunfire and explosions, marking the brutal battle taking place far beneath him. The American-trained Chinese soldiers were engaged in a desperate struggle with Japanese troops, their survival depending in part on the success of the airmen above. The heat in the cockpit was stifling. Sweat trickled slowly down Adair's back, soaking into his flight suit, but his focus never wavered. He and his fellow Banshees moved into position for their bombing run, their formation tight and disciplined. The less experienced pilots held back slightly, allowing Adair to take the lead in the first pass. Far below, Japanese soldiers noticed shapes against the sky and instinctively raised their hands to shield their eyes from the glaring sun, trying to make sense of the distant specks. What they saw next was enough to make even seasoned troops uneasy. The skull-faced planes swooping lower, preparing to strike. Adair pressed the release, sending his bombs hurtling downward. Moments later, the jungle erupted in flames and smoke as the explosives tore into the ground. The shockwaves rattled the earth beneath the Japanese soldiers' feet, sending debris flying in all directions. Pulling his aircraft sharply upward, Adair's plane angled skyward at roughly 45 degrees. That's when he spotted movement in the sky. Japanese aircraft. At the same time, he noticed his wingman, Lieutenant O'Connor, starting his own bombing run. Later, Adair would recall in vivid detail what happened next. 3 separate groups of Japanese Zero fighters, 15 planes, in all, were converging on them, their attack paths overlapping in a way that left little room for escape. Adair quickly realized they weren't coming for him. Their main targets were his wingman and the other 2 pilots trailing behind. Grabbing his radio, he sent a sharp warning: bandits, 11 o'clock high. Adair was no stranger to danger. His combat experience gave him the calmness to think quickly under pressure. But O'Connor, whom he fondly called Little OK, was far newer to situations like this. Adair's voice came over the radio again, more urgent this time. Little OK, make sure you drop your fuel tanks and bombs, then turn right into the clouds to get away from the Zeros. O'Connor responded immediately, releasing his bombs without hesitation. But luck was against him. His auxiliary fuel tank was jammed and wouldn't drop. By now, 4 enemy planes were bearing down on him, closing the distance fast. With no other choice, O'Connor rolled his plane into a hard, banking turn, trying to shake them off. Adair watched the tense chase from above, as all 5 planes E-40s and O'Connor's P-40 disappeared into a thick cloud bank. The rest of the Japanese fighters broke formation, spreading out to focus on the remaining American planes. But Adair was already maneuvering to help his wingman. He pushed his throttle forward, the engine roaring as he dove into the cloud after him. When he burst out into open air on the other side. There was nothing, no sign of O'Connor, no flash of his skull-painted plane. Adair scanned the sky frantically, searching for any friendly aircraft. Instead, his eyes caught movement across a wide clearing in the jungle. 4 Japanese Zeros in tight formation, heading straight for him. Without hesitation, he swung his plane toward them, the gap between them shrinking rapidly. He placed the lead aircraft in his gun sight, steadying his aim. Waiting for the moment when the enemy fighter filled the reticle completely, his finger tightened on the trigger, and he opened fire. Long streams of bright tracer fire arced out from Adair's guns, glowing like fiery threads in the sunlight as they stretched toward the oncoming Japanese fighters. The rounds tore through the air at incredible speed, but before the distance closed enough for them to hit, the enemy pilots abruptly changed course. One after another, their planes banked sharply away, peeling off to avoid the deadly line of fire. The sudden maneuver left empty sky where his targets had been only moments before. Without hesitating, Adair pushed the nose of his battered P-40 down slightly and slid into the shelter of a thick, rolling cloud bank. Inside the cloud, the world around him transformed into a swirling, featureless gray. The roar of his engine filled his cockpit, reverberating in the enclosed space like a living heartbeat. Moisture clung to his canopy, streaking sideways as his plane cut through the damp air. For a few seconds, the chaos outside seemed far away. But when he burst back into the open sky, the respite vanished instantly. His eyes scanned the horizon and, there they were, more enemy planes. Dark shapes moved steadily in the distance, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky. Before long, another group appeared. 4 more Japanese fighters, flying in a tight, disciplined formation, heading straight toward him. They didn't hesitate. Neither did he. Adair angled his plane into a direct intercept, his hand steady on the stick, closing the gap between them. As the seconds ticked by, the first 3 enemy planes suddenly broke to the left, banking away before he could line up a clean shot. The 4th pilot, however, stayed the course, flying straight toward him without flinching. Adair's eyes narrowed as he judged the distance. He didn't waste ammunition on a long shot. He waited, closing the gap until the target filled more of his gun sight. The moment the range felt perfect, he squeezed the trigger. The P-40's 6.50 caliber guns roared to life, sending streams of heavy rounds into the oncoming Zero. The effect was immediate. The Japanese fighter seemed to come apart in mid-air, its fuselage splitting, its wings tearing away. Fragments spun wildly through the air as the remains of the plane began their long fall toward the jungle canopy far below. Without giving himself time to watch the kill, Adair pulled hard into another cloud bank, letting the dense mist hide his position. But the sky offered little peace that day. Through a gap in the cloud, he suddenly caught sight of another fighter, one coming straight at him. Adair turned his nose toward it, meeting its approach head-on. Neither pilot swerved. The enemy machine grew larger and larger in his sight until it seemed almost too close to miss. He fired first, his guns hammering. Outbursts of lead, the enemy opened up in return, and now the space between them was filled with glowing arcs of tracer fire. Adair couldn't see his own bullets in the glare, but the enemies were bright, streaking dangerously close. The canopy of the approaching fighter grew so large in his sight that it nearly filled the glass. Then, in a sudden blur, the plane roared overhead, passing so close he could feel a strange rush of warm air through the thin metal of his cockpit and hear the growl of the other engine as it screamed past. Instinct took over. Adair rolled his P-40 upside down and dropped toward a lower altitude, his body pressing into the straps of his harness. From his inverted position, he caught sight of a Zero painted an unusually bright shade of green, its surface glinting like polished metal under the sun. A few moments later, another enemy plane appeared, this one flying from the opposite direction and slightly lower than he was. Adair seized the advantage. With his altitude giving him more speed, he dove toward the lower plane, swinging in behind it. The Japanese fighter was a Ki-43 Hayabusa, nicknamed the Peregrine Falcon for its speed and agility. But Adair knew its weakness: light armor. He adjusted his aim just ahead of where the enemy was flying, anticipating its movement, and squeezed the trigger. His rounds ripped through the wing in an instant. The fragile structure broke away, sending the plane rolling uncontrollably. It spiraled downward, the silver of its fuselage flashing once before smashing into the jagged rocks below that made 2 enemy aircraft he was certain he had destroyed in the fight. He had fired at several others earlier, but in the chaos, he couldn't be sure if any of those rounds had struck home. Now the sky around him was empty of friendly planes, and the radio was silent. His P-40 was riddled with bullet holes. His fuel gauge was dipping dangerously low, and the nearest friendly base lay far to the north. He turned his nose toward home, climbing slightly to get a better view of the sky ahead. The relief he hoped for didn't come instead. His heart sank. 5 more Japanese fighters were heading straight toward him. They had every advantage: numbers, speed, and position. He had none. There was no point in engaging. Adair banked hard to the south, trying to open the distance. The control stick vibrated in his hands, the damaged plane shuddering with each movement. Behind him, the enemy formation tightened. Within moments, tracer rounds were slicing past his canopy, glowing streaks that seemed to hunt him in the air. He yanked the controls, throwing the P-40 into a violent defensive maneuver. The wings groaned under the strain as he rolled, climbed, and twisted, the world outside becoming a blur of spinning metal, sunlight, and sky. He could hear the whine of enemy engines as they slashed past his field of view, their guns flashing. Again and again, bullets cut the air around him, some passing close enough that he could almost imagine feeling their heat. Then, in the middle of this deadly dance, his eyes caught something ahead, a possible escape, though one lined with danger. A huge bank of thick clouds loomed before him, their tops billowing high into the sky. Cutting through them like a jagged spear was a towering rock formation, its dark stone gleaming in the sun. It was a place where one wrong move could mean smashing into solid rock, but it might be the only cover between him and the Japanese fighters closing in fast. Adair knew he had only seconds to make a decision. His situation was desperate. He was badly outnumbered. His plane had taken multiple hits, his fuel was running low, and enemy fighters were pressing in from behind. Every second he stayed in the open was another chance for a bullet to find him. His eyes flicked toward the looming bank of clouds ahead, thick and heavy, pierced by a jagged rock formation that jutted upward like a spear from the earth. Flying into that cover was risky. One wrong move could mean slamming into the solid stone at high speed, but staying out in the open sky was certain death. With his mind made up, Adair shoved the stick forward, and the nose of his P-40 dipped into a steep dive. The engine roared in protest as he aimed for the clouds, the rock growing larger and larger in his view. The white mist swallowed him in seconds, erasing the world outside. The inside of the cloud was like flying through a dream. No sky, no ground, just swirling gray and the thundering sound of his own machine. He couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, his eyes straining to pick out any shape that might be the rock's dark outline. His fingers were tight on the stick, adjusting constantly to avoid an unseen collision. Somehow, through a mixture of instinct, experience, and pure luck, he slipped past the towering stone without touching it. A moment later, the blinding whiteness broke apart, and sunlight flooded the cockpit again. The air was calmer here, and the enemy fighters were nowhere to be seen. Adair climbed slightly and turned his nose north, heading for home. Grabbing his radio, he called out, "Bamboo, 2, come in." "O'Connor, do you copy?" The only reply was static. He tried again, calling for each of his pilots in turn. Still nothing. The realization hit him hard. This might be the first time he had truly lost his entire flight. The thought sat heavy in his chest, dull and cold, as he kept flying toward the base at Nguli. Then, far ahead, through the haze, a speck appeared. As it drew closer, the familiar red nose of a P-40 came into view. Adair's pulse jumped. It was O'Connor, somehow still in the fight for survival. But the way the plane flew told its own story. It limped through the air, nose slightly dipping, the tail shivering. Adair pulled alongside and took in the damage. The auxiliary belly tank was still attached. The fuselage was riddled with bullet holes, jagged tears in the metal letting sunlight flash through. The canopy had a large, ugly gap where a 20mm cannon shell had struck. And inside the cockpit, O'Connor slumped low, blood soaking through the left side of his flight suit in a dark, misty stain. When O'Connor spotted him, he sat up weakly and made a quick gesture toward his dead instrument panel. Adair scanned the outside of the plane. No smoke from the engine, no fuel streaming from the wings. That was something. At least he kept position off O'Connor's wing, and together the two of them angled north. For Nguli the sky was empty around them, a quiet that felt almost wrong after so much chaos. The sudden crackle of the radio shattered that silence. "Bamboo leader, this is Bamboo 3. Do you read?" The voice was faint but familiar. It was Tom Rogers. He reported that he was circling above Sadia in his P-40 but didn't dare try a landing alone. His aircraft had taken serious damage, and he wasn't sure it would hold together on approach. Adair looked at O'Connor's battered fighter, knowing that diverting to Rogers would eat up valuable fuel he couldn't really spare. Before long, Rogers' P-40 came into view. Even at a distance, the scars of battle were visible. Holes peppered both wings and the fuselage. As Adair drew closer, his trained eyes spotted another problem. The landing gear hung low, sagging in a way that told him both tires were flat. Landing like that would mean a fast, rough stop, and a bad approach could flip the plane entirely. Adair formed a quick plan. O'Connor would land first since his airspeed gauge was still working, and Rogers would follow, the flat tires bringing him to a stop quickly. Adair would lead them in from behind, watching over both, then circle above until they were safely down. They lined up for the final approach. At the last second, Adair pulled up and banked away, his eyes locked on the strip below. Relief washed over him as he saw both planes touch down, bumping hard but staying upright. Moments later, he landed himself. As he taxied to a stop, he spotted something unexpected. Martinez, another member of the flight, was already on the ground and completely unharmed. Rogers climbed from his aircraft uninjured as well, though his plane had been hit an astonishing 123 times. Adair jumped from his cockpit and ran toward O'Connor's P-40. The damage was even worse. Up close, holes punched clean through the fuselage, torn metal hanging loose, and the canopy ripped open. Inside, O'Connor was pale and clearly in pain, blood covering the left side of his body where the cannon shell had struck and blown through the cockpit. He would survive the day, but the injuries ended his flying career. As far as Adair knew, O'Connor never returned to combat. Years later, the wounds from that mission still troubled him, and in the end, they claimed his life. But for that one day, against overwhelming odds, the impossible had happened. For pilots had taken off, and all four had made it home alive. Adair's performance in the air that day only added to his reputation. Stories about his flying spread quickly, including one incredible account of the time he supposedly flew his P-40 upside down just to make it home. That story, like the one he lived today, would become part of the legend, preserved in film for anyone curious enough to see just how far Phil Adair could push both man and machine when survival was on the line. Looking back, it's hard to believe they all made it home that day. The odds were against them from the very start: enemy numbers, heavy damage, and the constant risk of running out of fuel. But courage, skill, and a refusal to leave anyone behind turned what should have been a tragedy into a story of survival. It wasn't just about flying a plane. It was about trust, loyalty, and the will to keep going when everything seemed lost. Phil Adair and his men didn't just win a fight. In the sky, they proved what it meant to come home together.